We live in a fallen world full of sin, evil, pain, death. Yet a lot of this is caused by natural evils that humans do not inherently catalyze. Yet we worship a God who is loving and gracious and merciful. Yet we live in a world with all this evil. Doesn't God have the power to take this pain away, to make the world better? Why do these horrific things happen that we do not inherently cause? Why does God allow the natural evil in our world? This is a very difficult subject that many have struggled to answer for centuries. Even among Christian circles today, many people debate why God would allow this kind of suffering in the world. To answer this question, we're going to look at 4 philosophies, from divinity professor Dr. Kate Bowler, Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, theologian David Bentley Hart, and Christian author C.S. Lewis. Dr. Kate Bowler was a researcher of the American Prosperity Gospel, a recent movement that emphasizes the idea that God will bless you abundantly for your faithfulness. She eventually was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and she was terminally ill. And she dealt with many people falsely encouraging her, saying things such as everything happens for a reason and that everything happens for some kind of plan. And while she was ill, she found herself appreciating the love others had for her, and she felt an inexperienceable feeling of love from those around her. And she finds that when it comes to suffering and evil, that life is full of suffering and love. Fuller finds that there is this tension between the evil and suffering in our world, as well as the love. For the suffering to exist in the world also has to coexist with the love that we experience from others and even from God. And she understands that may not be able to answer the question why suffering is there, but she understands that there has to be tension for both. And she explains it in her TED Talk, and she puts it this way.
I can't reconcile the contradiction, except that I am beginning to believe that these opposites do not cancel each other out. Life is so beautiful, and life is so hard.
Next, we have Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a famous Stoic philosopher, and he believes in the idea of the divine nature of providence. And he believes that providence rules over everything, and that everything that happens fulfills providence in some kind of way. So in turn, Marcus Aurelius is a determinist. So in his eyes, natural evil occurs to fulfill providence in some way, or in his eyes, he doesn't necessarily see it as evil because it fulfills providence. And he says it this way in his meditations. The substance of the universe is obedient and compliant, and the reason which governs it has in itself no cause for doing evil, for it has no malice, nor does it do evil to anything, nor is anything harmed by it. But all things are made and perfected according to this reason. David Bentley Hart talks about how suffering and evil is simply an aspect of the world that God created, but he also emphasizes that's what we are saved from, and that when we turn to God, we are ultimately saved from that. And he believes that we shouldn't believe that there is some kind of greater purpose in the natural evil. And he emphasizes Christian thought has traditionally, of necessity, defined evil as a privation of the good, possessing no essence or nature of its own, a purely parasitic corruption of reality. Hence, it can have no positive role to play in God's determination of himself or purpose for his creation. He further talks about how the world is naturally a struggle between the light and dark and good and evil, and that we have hope that one day the victory will occur, and that this victory over death and sin will happen in the new restored kingdom. Last, we have C.S. Lewis, and Lewis talks about suffering and evil. When we look at it, it's kind of like fog, where we do not know necessarily what's going on, and we may not be able to see everything clearly, but there's a higher order to what's going on. And just because we can't see it clearly now doesn't mean we should give up. We should focus on how we can learn from the suffering around us and grow individually. And he sees Christianity as a way to cope with this. And he sees God not as absent, because God came down and put on flesh on earth, and he endured the suffering, he endured the pain, and he atoned for those who commit evil and for everything and for all the evil in the world. And our idea of suffering is based on preconceived notions of God, according to Lewis. And he talks about, but Christ came to shatter that, and how he bared the suffering and pain so that we may be saved. And he talks about how he says, my idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. He shatters it himself. He is the great inoculist. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? The incarnation is the supreme example. It leaves all previous idea of the Messiah in ruins. In terms of the differences of the view, the obvious difference is that Marcus Aurelius views providence as the force governing all the natural evil, while the others view God in this way. David Bentley Hart talks about how Christians should not view natural evil as having some kind of greater purpose, which is in contrast to all the other views. Marcus Aurelius views that providence has purpose for the natural evil. C.S. Lewis talks about how natural evil serves to test him and we can learn from suffering. And then since Kate Bowler talks about living with that tension, then the natural evil and suffering has a purpose there. Also, David Bentley Hart and C.S. Lewis put a big emphasis on how the natural evil and suffering and pain that we experience is what Christ came to save us from, and put a big emphasis on salvation and how in heaven there will not be this kind of natural evil while the others do not. Lastly, it's interesting to note how David Bentley Hart, C.S. Lewis, and Kate Bowler all go through a time of moratorium or a period where they struggle with their view on this natural evil compared to the Meditations with Marcus Aurelius, where he does not necessarily go through this point. It's just interesting to see how the others struggled with their viewpoint on this, while Marcus Aurelius has such a big trust in providence that he did not necessarily question this as much. In terms of similarities, we see Hart and Bowler talk about an idea of tension, and Bowler talks about how life is full of suffering and death, but also Hart talks about how there is naturally a struggle between the light and dark and the good and evil. Marcus Aurelius and C.S. Lewis also have a similar idea. Aurelius believes in providence and the higher order structure of that. And Lewis also talks about in his fog analogy, talking about how we can't necessarily see what's going on, but there is a higher order structure. So both would agree that there is a higher purpose and a higher order to what is happening. And even with that higher order structure, the higher purpose of what's going on, Bowler's idea of living with tension could align with that. It could talk about how the tension is part of that higher order structure that we see. We just simply are not able to fully understand it. In terms of why I think natural evil exists, I truthfully may not be able to say why. Yet I understand that it has a very specific purpose. In the book of Job, Job cries out to God, "The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And this is that tension that he lives with. And even later when he has an audience with God and God takes him on this tour of the universe, there's still that tension that he explains has to be there. And even Bowler talks about how she understands how there's the suffering and the pain, yet she appreciates the love. And I sympathize with that, where I appreciate the love too. Another reason that Lewis talked about earlier in his life was how we don't turn to God when all is well, and I definitely see that in my own life. Some reasonable individuals would argue that, do we have to turn to God just because of we see suffering, or why not because out of his loving nature or the beauty we see? And I would say, yes, I agree with that, but often with our sinful nature, we can often pollute us to the love that we see. And some would say, well, doesn't this make God petty or insecure or seemingly something like that? But I would say no, because Jesus told Philip to look at himself to see the character of the Father in the book of John. So when we see Jesus and we see the compassion, love, benevolence, this is the character of God. And he uses the natural evil in our world to do this and to bring us closer to him. And yet why that specifically exists, I cannot answer, and that comes back to living with that tension.